Deep within the mountains, the old treasury lay. Vines covered the obscure ruins. Scars and marks of time slashed the walls of stacked metal and large rocks. Gawain, Rebecca, Amber, and Sir Byron entered the mountain through the largest arched door. The flickering light of their torches lit up the corridors on both sides, giving it all a ghoulish appearance as their shadows danced along the walls. Amber whined to Rebecca. "If only Aunt Heidi came along instead. What good is it to bring you along? You're called a mage, but you can't even use an illumination spell." Rebecca went as red as her fireball. Fire can also be used for illumination. Even though she was right, Rebecca's voice wavered nervously. Sir Byron walked not far behind Gawain. He looked at the notches on the ancient stone wall and could not help but be reminded of his mercenary days years ago. How old are these ruins? Gawain shook his head. "I don't know. The first time we discovered it, it was already in ruins. Back then, it was surmised that these were the remains of the meteoric era. In other words, the middle to later period of the great advancement of magic in the Gondolian Empire. The Azure Fount had successfully activated, and it heralded a wave of expansion in the empire. A large number of fortresses and research facilities were built at various frontiers in order to find another concentration of magic like the Azure Fount. But one by one, those facilities were all abandoned. Rebecca was fascinated by the history lesson. Did they not find even one other spot of concentrated magic like the Azure Fount? Gawain recalled the history from his memory. No, the power of the Azure Fount is beyond your imagination. A massive magical power source in the center of the continent. The energy it outputs every day can even sustain all of Anzu's current Mage Tower's operation for a month. Some scholars even theorized that the explosion of the Azure Fount in Gondolia actually caused the Dark Wave, due to a large tear the explosion made in the elemental plane. Of course, this conjecture could not be proven. The Azure Fount has been completely destroyed and no one could possibly investigate it. Rebecca was shocked that humans were once able to control that level of power. Wow, the Gondolian Empire was so powerful back then. Gawain nodded. In any case, there was never another area of concentrated magic discovered that came even close to matching the Azure Fount. I suspect this was one of the research facilities abandoned all those millennia ago. Amber shivered in paranoid fear. There isn't going to be any out-of-control ancient magic monsters or magic traps or anything like that, right? Gawain glanced at the nervous half-elf. You dug up my grave. Why are you afraid of an abandoned facility over 1,000 years old? Amber bounced up and down as she argued back. They're not the same. Even if someone were to come out from his coffin, he's still only a person. But if something pops out in this ancient facility, we won't even know what it might be. I heard that ancient facilities keep monsters and colossi created by mad scientists. Gawain's vein bulged out at his temples. Rumors of the Dark Mountains and now horror stories of ancient facilities. Where do you get all your inaccurate information from? Amber shot over a mysterious smile. I was chosen by the goddess of the night. Sometimes when I pray, the goddess will reveal something to me. It was all from her. Rebecca conjured a mini fireball the size of a pebble and threw it at Amber. It exploded into a poof before it could hit Amber, but the burst of ash covered the thief's face in soot. Amber balked and then cried out, Are you crazy? How could you actually throw a fireball at me? Rebecca shrugged. The goddess of the night should have told you it would happen. Gawain face-palmed. They arrived at an ancient door before any bickering could continue. A heavy giant gate made of purplish-black metal stood before them. This giant gate was the typical style of the Gondolian meteoric era. An abstract relief of soldiers and city walls had been carved along the surface. Amber wiped away the black soot from her face, her eyes shimmering with greed. This door, could it be made up entirely of purple steel? Gawain bonked Amber's head with the hilt of his sword before she could place her hand on the door. For every piece that you scrape off, I'll have Rebecca throw a fireball into your face, so cast away those avaricious ideas of yours. It would be wiser for you to wait for me to pay you myself. Amber tilted her head and grumbled. Oh, miser. Gawain ignored her and reached into his pocket. He withdrew a glittering object. The platinum disc that had been stored back in 4 Crown Street of Sansonial glowed in his hand. Rebecca looked at the rust on the object. It's been several centuries. Will this key really work? Gawain nodded. This is technology from the Gondolian Empire. As long as the main structure of the facility has not collapsed, its main gate will not fail. As if to prove that what he said was true, the complex veined patterns on the platinum disc lit up one by one just as he spoke those words. Then, strands of light streaked along the relief on the heavy metal gate, travelling from the disc onto the carved patterns. When the light filled the entire gate, mechanical sounds came from the door and the rock walls on both sides. Everyone felt the ground trembling slightly under their feet, and with this tremor the door slowly opened. Gawain gripped his sword instinctively. He cast a basic night spell under his breath. Breath of protection. An invisible barrier shrouded the whole party from the musty air and potentially poisonous gases that had built up over the last several hundred years. After careful observation, Gawain lifted the protection and nodded to the others. He stepped through the gate first. Sir Byron followed after. Amber hesitated, looking to the purple steel door, but she decided to give up on the idea of scraping a piece of the rare metal. As they ventured into the mountain facility, a large hall greeted them. A pile of old relics piled up across the hall, obscuring the doors on each side of the wall. Gawain observed runes along the walls and floor, ensuring that the items kept here did not rust. Amber raced forth to stacks of metal ingots, crystals of various colours, swords, armour, and several large boxes as tall as half an average person were stacked in the centre. The half-elf jumped up and down like it was Christmas, or whatever the equivalent of Christmas was in this world. Gawain stabbed his Sword of the Founder into a box. He pried the lid open and found the box filled with dazzling gold and silver coins. Gawain looked at the half-elf. "Wipe your drool, Amber." She did. All of them took turns prying open the boxes, finding neatly arranged purple crystals and more golden coins. The most valuable items were not the gold and silver coins, but the purple crystals. The ancient Gondolian Empire had dominated the continent with advanced magic. The magical power from the Azure Fount provided mages with an endless supply of magical energy. Even the worst mages could find success with the help of the fount. Thus, the Gondolian Empire had achieved something almost unthinkable to the 4 kingdoms today: the mass production of enchanted gear. Swords and armour are not typically imbued with magic. No matter how strong and sharp they were just ordinary equipment. Only equipment containing magical power could be called enchanted gear. In Anzu today, enchanted weapons and equipment were the only things that could be issued by the military specifically to the top brass. But during the height of Gondolier, it was standard issue to equip every single soldier in the army with a long sword enchanted with enhanced sharpening and an energized crystal. Gawain picked up the small purple crystal. "Sir Byron, swing your sword at me." The knight frowned. "Do you mean it?" Gawain grinned. "Come on, give me your best shot." Though hesitant, Sir Byron readied his stance and slashed at Gawain. Rebecca covered her eyes, but right as the blade would cleave the Grand Duke in half, he raised the crystal. The purple crystal expanded out into a purple, translucent shield and blocked Sir Byron's attack. The purple shield flickered and faded. "That was close. These crystals do not seem to have much magic left in them." Amber was starry-eyed. "How did you do that?" Gawain picked up another crystal with a dim purple glow. These were shields for a common soldier back in Gondolier. They expanded automatically, capable of distinguishing between the enemy and the wearer. Some even had explosive spell molds, meaning once the crystals grew too weak after sustaining multiple blows, they could be thrown at the enemies to create an explosion. He knew it. Everyone knew it. Especially for the Anzu kingdom, a weapon like this was incredibly advanced. Gawain also knew, however, that infusing these crystals with magic would require the Azure Fount. That meant these crystals could now only be used once. Even so, Gawain was certain these crystals would be the cornerstone of building out his new territory. Seeing those dazzling gold coins and crystals, Rebecca, Amber, and Sir Byron were unsurprisingly speechless. Byron had seen his fair share of treasures in the mountains as a former mercenary. But compared to those dull antiques, this heap of gold and crystals protected by runes was on another level. As a noble from a declining clan, the treasures that Rebecca had seen in the Cecil Castle could not hold a candle to everything in this vault. And of course for Amber, the notorious bandit, for the first time she felt how difficult it would be for her to steal everything away. They looked around at some of the other equipment. All of these artifacts were standard equipment from the Gondolian period. Because the magic gear could not be recharged with magic without the azure fount, all of these relics have faded in time, absent even from history books. So even to the well-studied Rebecca, the artifacts looked foreign, almost alien. Amber, of course, salivated at the thought of how much all of these things were worth. She ran her fingers through a box of coins. Whoa! Gondolia's long-lost silver coins and the three-leaf golden flower coins, my God! Her head nearly sank into the pile of coins. It's all money! Boss, we're rich, we're rich! Gawain smirked. When he had no money, she called him a miser. Now that he had money, she called him boss. Gawain pulled out Amber from the pile of money. Calm down, this is my money, not yours. Amber gave a dramatic salute. As your most loyal follower, your money is my money. Gawain sighed. These coins are the least valuable things here. The real treasure is these crystals. Do you still not understand? He turned to Rebecca. As a mage, you should get acquainted with these. A single one increases the combat ability of a soldier tenfold. Much of the magical energy latent inside these crystals has dissipated over time, so only about a third of the magic remains. Until we have a way to recharge them, we must use them wisely. Even as Gawain emphasized upon the poor condition of these artifacts, Rebecca and Amber were still dazed, staring at them. For the poor Cecil clan, deteriorated riches were still riches. Sir Byron's mouth went dry seeing all the treasures. What a load of valuables! To think that they have just been hidden here along the kingdom's border. Gawain shook his head. Actually, this is thanks to the civil war from 100 years ago. The Mohun lineage would be aware of these assets' existence. But with the supposed Second Dynasty, the new kings must not have been aware. Deep down, Gawain lamented the feudal system where all wealth belonged to the king and the lords. If a clan's lineage ever broke, the wealth could not be inherited, only stolen and fought over. At best, the treasures and wealth were forgotten about, just like the ones stashed away in these mountains. Rebecca took a seat and sighed a breath of relief. With all this, we can pay off the debt to Viscount Andrew and buy all the proper food and materials we need. Gawain was quick to shake his head. No, we can't spend the money immediately. Rebecca frowned at first, but pieced together the logic. Because these are antiques? Gawain nodded. If we took these 700-year-old Gondolian gold and silver coins to buy things from people, even the most stupid would be able to guess that the Cecil clan found treasure in the Dark Mountains. Until we establish our territory some more, we mustn't let this leak out. Rebecca pouted. What do we do then? We need the money now to establish our territory in the first place. Gawain held up a coin and smiled gleefully. The benefits of living in an era where precious metal is used as a currency means that even if we change its form, gold is still gold, silver is still silver. All we need to do is melt them down. Amber's jaw dropped in horrified shock. What? Melt them? These are 700-year-old ancient gold and silver coins. You might as well sell them on the black market. Gawain sighed. These 700-year-old ancient gold and silver coins have been kept in mint condition. They're already so rare you can only find pictures of them. Sure, you may be able to sell 1 or 2 of them, but 6 boxes of them? You'll never come back alive. Amber thought of carrying one of the chests and escaping, but upon seeing Gawain's arm, which was thicker than her thigh, she suppressed the impudent idea. Instead, she rolled on the floor and whined. Still, you can't melt them all. It's too wasteful. Gawain smiled. Of course. We're only melting enough to solve our problems at hand. We'll seal up the rest and use them when they might come in handy. Finally, Amber relaxed. Gawain looked to Rebecca. Now, do you know why I specifically asked that my title be kept as Grand Duke? Rebecca batted her eyes. Amber shot up from the ground. Of course! Dukes have the right to produce coins. So you were already thinking of melting these antiques back then, right? Gawain nodded. You can say that. I'm now a Grand Duke with no ties to any territory. Even so, I still have the rights that come naturally with being a Grand Duke according to the law. The right to mint coins is just one of them. Amber's eyes glistened as she looked at Gawain. You ancient nobles are the best. So much better than those lazy aristocrats who only know how to raise taxes. Gawain instilled some final words of wisdom. Let's set our sights on the future. Play things right, and this entire vault of treasures will be worth nothing compared to what we can accrue in the future. They took as much as they could carry and headed back out to the base of the mountain. There, they set up camp with the help of some trusted soldiers. The same soldiers moved in and out of the dark mountains under Gawain's supervision, moving the rest of the coins and crystals out to the camp. They also gave the warrior outside a proper burial. A mere pile of rocks would not suffice, especially if people intended to settle in these lands. Gawain and the party left the mountains after sealing the vault with the platinum disc. The base camp near the riverbank was still under construction, but it was nearing completion. Byron and Philip bought a large number of tents back in Tanzan town. Mere cloth and wood were easy to set up, but it wasn't much for the 800 civilians. Gawain remained confident that this would only be temporary. With the help of Heidi's supportive spells, the riverbank camp started to take shape. All the tents were propped up on the south side of the White River in the shape of a fan. Important materials such as food and ironware were kept in the center of the camp, and the stripped wood was stockpiled along the riverbank. Once emptied, carts and caravans used for transport were kept at the edges of the camp, serving as temporary walls. Although the dark wave had subsided, they were completely out in the wilderness, cut off from civilization. Who knew what beasts might appear? Next to a tent in the middle of the camp, Gawain found Heidi, looking exhausted. He wondered if the ancient crystals they had recovered from the mountains might rejuvenate the tired mage. Gawain tossed a light purple crystal at Dame Heidi. The mage caught it reflexively, then stared at the treasure in surprise. This is what you were telling me about back in Tanzan town, the treasure house in the mountain. Gawain nodded. But of course, that's where I found these. The technology is from the golden age of Gondolia. Can you understand its rune structure? Heidi examined the glowing purple crystal. Light refracted through its body as she turned it about in her hands. Any mage whose head hadn't been squashed by a door would immediately realize the value such crystals had. So Heidi was enthralled. After a moment's examination, she shook her head. I'm sorry, Ancestor. I'm only a level 3 mage, so I cannot produce something so advanced. Gawain put his hand on the crystal. Heidi looked up, her eyes meeting his. I'm not asking you to produce it, only to analyze it. I don't think anyone in this era can create something like this. Its power stems from the azure font itself. Just draw out its rune structure if you can. A chill went down Heidi's spine when Gawain referenced the azure font. The legendary name still held power, even if it had long since been destroyed. She looked back at the crystal and peered close at it. I can read the rune structure. I just need a crystal resonator that will allow us to project out the inscriptions from within. But what's the use of reading a rune structure by itself? Without the energy to activate it, that's just a fancy diagram. Gawain shrugged. We'll worry about that later. Since these crystals can no longer be produced, we should save as much information about them as possible, at least before their energy is lost forever. Heidi nodded. She walked over to a table which she had built to serve as a planning desk in their camp. She stashed the crystal away in a bag hanging off of the chair. Gawain followed, observing her face. The dame looked tired, but news of the treasure seemed to ease her stress a little. Gawain's eyes passed over the camp. The tents had almost all been set up. Meanwhile, artisans and carpenters were already hard at work creating temporary structures, shelters for rain and paddocks for livestock. Several campfires had been built for the evening, and both hunters and loggers were going to and from the woods, accompanied by soldiers. How fares the construction? Heidi sighed. She gestured with her hand at the commotion around them. All the tents should be up before sundown. And the carpenters have nearly finished a perimeter fence. Next on my agenda is to set up warning runes and magic traps to keep wild animals or unexpected visitors out. After we've set up the temporary camp, we're going to let some wood drift downstream to be collected closer to the site of the main settlement. An idea seemed to occur to her. She reached into her bag and withdrew a piece of black metal. She tossed it to Gawain, who caught it. He looked at it for a second before returning his gaze to Heidi. "Iron ore," she nodded. "Just like you said. I sent some scouts east and they were able to dig up some, though we left most in place since we have no way of smelting it yet." She heaved a sigh and rubbed her forehead. "The main problem is a lack of manpower. We have so much to accomplish and we're already stretched to our limit." Gawain waved his hand. "The main party arrives in 3 days. That'll help alleviate the burden on our group. They'll also bring more necessary tools and supplies." Heidi bowed slightly. "As you say, Lord Ancestor." Gawain walked through the camp, observing their progress. Seeing the fledgling establishment made him feel a surge of ambition. With Gawain Cecil's memories and influence and my perspective from my other life, we can make something truly incredible here. People had already dug some channels in the dirt, which would be filled with water from the White River. That was a necessary step to prevent a fire from spreading. The fence seemed well constructed too, if a bit rudimentary. Yet the thing that struck him the most was the general mood of the camp. In dealing with Byron and Heidi and Amber and Rebecca, he was used to excitement and hope being the prevailing emotions. But the faces he beheld amongst the people were all indifferent at best and forlorn at worst. This manifested itself in the work itself. Once each task had been completed, the workers seemed content to sit back down. They were only interested in the bare minimum. Gawain gritted his teeth. Heidi couldn't supervise them all, and when left to their own devices, they weren't even interested in tying the tents down properly. "What's the matter, old-timer?" Gawain nearly jumped as Amber appeared perched on the fence next to him, eating an apple. He shook his head. "This camp, it's not built to any sort of standard. It'll be overtaken by wild animals in days." Amber shrugged. "What type of work do you expect from tired people who don't know where their next meal is coming from?" "Personally, I wouldn't have given them hammers," Gawain growled. "Don't they realize that these tents and fences are their only protection for the near future?" His voice trailed off. Amber cocked her head at him. "What?" Gawain nodded. "That's it. Thank you." He rushed off, leaving Amber confusedly munching on the same apple. Gawain's mind was racing. He realized why the laborers didn't care to make the camp to a standard. As far as they were concerned, everything they built was for their lords. Even if they could stay in a tent for now, it might not be theirs later on. As soon as the lands could be used for a castle, they would be kicked out to make room for a grand stable. For the aristocracy, the people mattered less than the horses. He made his way back to Heidi's tent, where she and Rebecca were chatting. Immediately Rebecca hopped to her feet. Heidi was slower to rise. "Yes, Ancestor? Come with me." In a moment they were outside examining the fencing. Gawain gestured to a plank. "Look at this. It appears fine at a glance, but only one nail is holding this crossbeam on. If a wild hog ran into this with any degree of force, it would be knocked clean over. It should have at least 3 nails in it." Heidi averted her eyes. "My apologies, Ancestor. I supervised the construction, so it is my fault." Gawain laughed and shook his head. Both Dame Heidi and Rebecca looked at him confused. "No, it's not a problem of supervision. You can't be watching them put in every nail. It's a problem of morale." Rebecca coughed and chimed in. "Lord Ancestor, you can't expect too much from serfs. Many have hardly any education and more complicated tasks elude them." Gawain sighed. "Is it so complicated to build a fence? To put up tents?" Heidi nodded. "Military camps are strict, but we have civilians working on these. We cannot expect the same from them." Gawain stared at them. Sometimes he forgot that no matter how improved Rebecca and Heidi were over their peers, they were still aristocrats and still had a lot of work to do in order to understand that the system in their world had some huge flaws. And, to a certain degree, they still inherently believed that serfs and civilians were inferior in some way or another. He shook his head. It's not so complicated. Watch. He didn't need to fix their mindset overnight. But there was one way to start. Sir Byron! The knight dutifully appeared. Gather everyone while there's still light. Soldiers, serfs, the lot. Sir Byron snapped a salute. Within a quarter of an hour, the entire group was assembled. Even Amber, who was bragging to Betty about her adventure to the treasure house in the mountain, rushed over curiously. Betty followed beside her with a vacant expression. Everyone was wondering what this 700-year-old ancestor was planning to do. Even Dame Heidi and Rebecca didn't understand his methodology. Gawain stood on a large rock and looked down at the people below, numbering more than 100. From their expressions, he could tell they expected some sort of orders, more work tasks, or something similarly demoralizing. He had already noticed Amber sneakily hiding within the crowd. He was initially going to remove this punk, who was probably going to cause trouble, but on second thought, he just kept quiet about it. She needed to be here for this, too. Then he cleared his throat and bellowed over the crowd in his most authoritative voice. People of Cecil territory, I have something to tell you. It is about your future and the new law of the Clan Cecil. Gawain stood on top of the rock watching the withdrawn and indifferent faces below, and he took a deep breath. To call the low-class people of this world stupid would be a harsh way to put it, laced with judgment and prejudice. To call them ignorant, that was just stating a fact, especially since they were actively being held back by their society's very structure. Gawain couldn't help but wonder how ignorant he too would be if he had nothing to focus on but his own survival. However, given his audience, he needed to be careful about the type of speech to give. High-minded talk of ideals, the future, production capabilities, well, that was the language of lords. They would reject it offhand. Thus, he needed to give them what they needed. People of Cecil territory, you should all know who I am, so you should also know that I am the highest authority in this territory. My words are as good as the laws of Cecil territory. These laws will offer protection for you, and so you must also obey them. There was still some talking in the corner, as not every civilian was heeding him yet. We are exploring new territories, so we need some new rules. Therefore, I'll be making 3 decrees. Firstly, because the old territory has been destroyed along with all assets. As the ancestor of the Cecil clan, I declare that all debts owed to your lords will be written off. Regardless of whether you are a serf or a freeman, starting from today, you will no longer bear any debt to any lord. The crowd came to life as he made this decree. People talked excitedly amongst each other, but the excitement was muted, cautious. They were aware of the generosity of Viscount Rebecca, so this news, while excellent for everyone, might still come with a catch. Gawain held up his hand, and the crowd went quiet. Secondly, all serfs in the territory have the chance to become freemen. The nobility will issue a series of assignments, such as building houses, building roads, mining, and joining the army. All these assignments will come with their respective methods of accumulating points. As long as the work is completed in strict accordance with the requirements, you can accumulate contributions. After making the standard, a serf can then become a freeman. And if you are already a freeman, you can receive your respective monetary compensation upon completing these assignments. I will announce the detailed method for calculating rewards in the near future. I can assure you that any hard-working and reliable serf can become a freeman as long as he works hard for 2 or 3 years, and a freeman will be able to have his own house if he works hard for 5 or 6 years. If the first decree had won their attention, the second won their excitement. Serfs and civilians alike talked with each other, thrilled with the opportunity to improve their station. Though Viscount Rebecca had already put in place a policy of serfs being able to shed their status through military service, Gawain took it a whole step further. This worked especially well for those who didn't have the constitution for or the desire to join the army. Gawain grinned. Nobles of this world only want to enrich themselves by exploiting the serfs, if only they knew what benefits they could reap from free subjects. As for getting compensation, and even a house for work, many of the freemen could hardly believe it. They could get money by working for Clan Cecil. Who would believe that? Even though the cacophony was great, Gawain spoke over it. The citizens quickly quieted down to hear what he had to say. Thirdly, the tents and fences to be built today, as well as the gutters in the camp, are the first assignment under this new law. I have already gotten people to record the area that each of you is responsible for. Only those who complete the work strictly in accordance with my requirements will be considered as having completed the work. In addition, as an incentive for doing the work seriously, the first 10 people who complete their work will have the first choice of the meat. With that said, Gawain jumped off the rock. The civilians and serfs stood dumbly for a moment in stunned silence. Then, as if from a silent cue, they rushed off to complete the finishing touches on their tasks. Gawain paid no mind to them and walked straight up to Rebecca and Heidi. The two women watched the exuberant crowd with eyes wide and mouths agape. Gawain gestured over his shoulder at the work now taking place behind him. See, people can be motivated once they know it will benefit them. Seeing those civilians and serfs swarming around, pushing and shouting as they ran off, Heidi was a little dumbstruck. She shook her head and blinked her eyes. My lord ancestor, did you really mean everything you said? Gawain smiled ambiguously. What specifically are you referring to? Heidi frowned. The part where a serf can become a freeman by doing hard work. Why, if this continues, it will only take a serf 2 or 3 years to become a freeman. Gawain nodded. But of course. Is there something wrong with that? Dame Heidi laughed in disbelief. Well, if they can become freemen so easily, then it won't be long before there are no serfs left, only civilians. The children of freemen will also be freemen. Then Clan Cecil will have no serfs. Gawain continued to look at her, wearing the same mysterious smile. What's wrong with not having serfs? Dame Heidi raised her finger as if the answer was obvious, but then stopped herself. Obviously, she knew that there was something wrong with not having serfs, but she couldn't articulate that at this moment. Rebecca, who had been silent all this time, took the time to chime in. Actually, I think that serfdom is an outdated system. It's no longer necessary. Gawain looked at the iron-headed descendant in surprise and nodded. Go on. Rebecca strode over to look at the men and women repairing the fences and fixing the tents. My father used to tell me that serfs would not work after they're freed, that civilians would become lazy and complacent. But why would they, if it is in their interest to work? Rebecca scratched her head. Driving someone with a whip seems less useful than driving them with a promise of meat for dinner. Gawain looked at her approvingly. Exactly. Rebecca, you have figured it out. Rebecca squealed in joy, not being used to receiving praise from her ancestor. I also noticed that if a serf is allowed to work, they will always try to goof off when their supervisor isn't watching. But if you let 2 serfs do the same job and tell them that the first one who finishes can get an extra piece of bread, they can then quickly complete the workload of 3 or 4 people. Their value far outweighs that of a piece of bread. Gawain laughed. Not bad, little Viscountess. Rebecca's view was simplistic, but it served his purposes for now. Gawain knew the abolition of slavery was not only a problem of whips and bread. This society had let a rot fester. Aristocrats dined in lavish halls and entertained themselves with their magic, while the whole society rested on a bed of oppressed workers who had no way to improve their lot in life but were kept in check by their so-called superiors. On Earth, these circumstances were fertile ground for a revolution. But nobles possessing magic made that impossible in Lauren. After all, 100 civilians with pitchforks were not a match for even a novice mage. Perhaps there would be a day when this deadlock would be broken, but Gawain had no plans to wait. He had to make this change happen, or the Dark Wave would destroy them all. Even the Gondolian Empire during its heyday could not even take on the Dark Wave. Now that all the nations had regressed to medieval, uncivilized states, how were they supposed to take on the Dark Wave? But even besides the Dark Wave, Gawain had another concern, a more pressing one. The eye in the sky, the place he lasted for millennia before descending. But how can I investigate that? It's not like I can have a medieval world overcome gravity, or can I? Gawain kept his grandest plans to himself. He kept them from Rebecca and Heidi. his most trusted companions. All he could do was break down his long-term strategies into stages and reveal each stage the further along they got. What they had done today could be said to be one of the most fundamental steps, especially for the development of this territory. Rebecca and Heidi marveled as the commoners and serfs worked with a vigor they had never seen. They knew, of course, that this was because of Gawain's promise of meat, a means to motivate and reward hard labor. Gawain himself knew what it was like to toil the fields all day under the beating sun, sweating so profusely that the throat went raspy and all water seemed to evaporate from the body. Of course, Gawain could not compare himself to the serfs. What he could do was feed them meat. After returning to the central tent, Gawain jotted down some things on parchment. At the same time, he gave Sir Byron some instructions. Have 2 people cook 10 servings of meat. Also make sure that everyone working has enough vegetable soup and black bread. We can't have anyone falling sick due to cold or hunger at the juncture. Byron looked astonished at the suggestion. 10 servings of meat? Gawain nodded. Of course. What good is my word if I can't promise a little meat? Byron stammered. I thought you were just going to boil a pot of meat soup. You only need to boil a large pot of soup with a few pieces of meat cut into the size of walnuts and vegetables, and they would already be grateful. Gawain waved his hands. Do as I say. I will not cut corners on the promises I have made. Ask the cooks to set up the pot at the most conspicuous location in the camp. I want everyone to see the meat being cooked. At the same time, make sure there are soldiers maintaining order by the sides to prevent people from fighting and snatching. Sir Byron could not understand the Grand Duke, but kept it to himself. He bowed and left to carry out his orders. Gawain returned to jotting thoughts down when he felt Amber's unblinking gaze on him. Is there something on my face? Amber squinted, applying even more focus. I was trying to see if you've been possessed by something. Perhaps something back in the vault. I have never heard of nobles who would reduce their wealth on their own accord. Gawain was slightly amused. Do you think that I am reducing my wealth with those actions? Amber shrugged. Are you not? By freeing serfs, it means that they only need to give you a portion of the food that they grow in the future. You also need to pay them with money from your own pocket. Why would any reasonable noble do that? Gawain set down his quill and turned to Amber. If I ordered you to build a wall, how much would you be able to do in a day if I didn't pay you anything? Amber pondered, then grinned. I would steal some coins from you and hire a person to do the job for me. Then I'll use the remaining money to buy liquor. Gawain blinked. Amber winked. That's just what any reasonable bandit would do. Dame Heidi stepped into the tent, saving Gawain from having to respond to Amber. Ancestor, this is absolutely unbelievable. I have never seen the serfs work so hard before. There isn't even a need for a supervisor to make sure they get the work done. Gawain shrugged. This is just common sense. The work that they will do when properly motivated will far outweigh the extra food and money we expend. Heidi looked out of the tent to the people working with renewed vigor. She shook her head, still in disbelief. I considered different incentives before, but not something to this extent. I dare not envision what the future of the territory would be like if this system is continued. Gawain smiled. It will be progress in the right direction. Trust me. Come over and look at these. Heidi walked over and looked at the notes Gawain had jotting down. There were terms she had never heard of before. Terms no one in this world heard of. Work comps, efficiency statistics, contract jobs, year-end assessments. What are these? Gawain showed another piece of paper. There's more. Since we're building from the ground up, I want to set up some infrastructural policies as our next step. Things like general education, magic affinity tests, and bureaus that will oversee specific facets of the territory. Gawain looked around. Where is Rebecca? She should be aware of this too. Heidi squinted as she peered out of the tent. Rebecca was on the south side of White River, burning weeds and shrubs. Heidi called out to her, and Rebecca scurried in quickly, her face covered in soot. Gawain laid out another piece of paper and stood up. I want to talk to you two about work shifts in camp. First, I want the workers to be grouped into teams of 5 to 10. Each group does the same work and follows the same schedule. Second, all of the teams will report to a supervisor before they start and after work. The supervisor will then monitor the performances of each team. Also, every team will have a team leader who will be in charge of assigning duties within the team. This leader will be chosen by the team itself. If at any point a team leader is affecting work efficiency, lying or hiding things from the supervisors and lords in any way, they will be replaced immediately. Gawain looked to Rebecca and Heidi, both of whom were dumbfounded. Teams will be assessed based on their work efficiency. There will be a meritocratic system that we can slowly implement. As for the serfs' point system to earn their freedom, Heidi, you will be in charge of noting each team's work for now. We can discuss the point values at a later time. Next, we'll have to discuss how to record the taking and returning of the tools as the teams switch shifts. Rebecca and Heidi felt dizzy. Rebecca stepped back and chuckled. Lord Ancestor, by making a simple job so complicated, wouldn't this hurt efficiency? Gawain shook his head. These measures may seem complicated, but this is a system that needs to be implemented. Once it is, we will see much more alarming efficiency compared to the tent pitching today. He sighed. His two descendants still did not look convinced. Look, change is difficult. Improvement is even harder. It will always be easier to keep things the way they are. But if you trust me, I will lead us towards building a land that the Anzu kingdom has never seen before. Heidi and Rebecca nodded slowly. Gawain sensed their confusion and hesitation still. He understood that everything he said was the equivalent of telling someone on Earth that the sun was actually purple. But he did not want them to blindly follow orders. He did not want the serfs and the commoners to blindly follow a lord, even if it made implementing his ideas easier. Gawain wanted to change this entire mindset, such that every member of the lower class in Cecil territory was not a lower class anymore, but a living, breathing human. He needed people, not slaves, because what he wanted to do was impossible to do with the might of a single person. Gawain went into a bit more detail about each of his steps. Heidi leaned in, soaking in all the procedures. It was important that they understood what they were doing, so that they could explain it to everyone else. Rebecca looked to Gawain as she finally started to understand. What about me? If Aunt Heidi has a task, I want one as well. Gawain perused a map of their territory and pointed away from the tents. Bring some people tomorrow to check the soil quality here. Confirm the difficulty of tilling new land and see how much we can put to use in these early stages. Don't go too far. Amber laughed out loud and leaned back against a tent pole. Was everyone during the days of the second settlement as crazy as you? He turned to Amber and winked. Of course. A serf working out on the field turned around. Another did the same. One by one, they all lifted their noses. They smelled the scent of meat. They heard a fire being made at the center of the camps. The most miraculous sound of all was the sizzling of meat. One of the serfs looked to another. So this lord is crazy, right? The other shrugged and continued working, even harder than he had already been. Most commoners and serfs could care less about who their lord was, so long as they could fill their stomachs. Do you really think we'll become freemen? The other serf shrugged. It's probably the new lord pretending to be benevolent. Who cares? Maybe they'll free one or two of us just for the sake of it. I bet the pay would still be terrible. Still, both of them toiled away. A lord who pretended to be benevolent was still far better than a vicious one who abused his people. Over the next couple of days, word spread about the new systems that were to be implemented. Most were confused by the idea of working in teams that competed against each other in terms of accomplished workloads. The serfs all around murmured amongst each other, betting on what part of the new regulations would become part of heavy taxation. More than anything, they didn't understand why their lord was turning simple labor into complicated tasks. The serfs all kept one thing in mind, however. The first place work team of the day got to eat meat, while the second and third place got as much bread with meat soup as they wanted. Even if this wasn't true, the promise of it was enough to keep the workers going. Soon, as the systems were slowly implemented, they saw that these weren't false promises. Those who did not work as efficiently received plain vegetable stew and black bread, forced to watch the first-place team happily devour the hard-earned meat off the bones. It soon became clear that even if becoming free was a false promise, The Cecil Lord held true to his word on giving meat to the best workers. Over the next couple of days, Heidi saw the people work like never before. Even without supervision, they worked as efficiently as possible in teams. The team leaders motivated everyone with the promise of sharing the meat equally, regardless of someone's responsibilities. As the tents were pitched, Rebecca led a group of people to survey the nearby land. Lumbermen went upstream of the White River early in the morning. Before noon, batches of timber flowed down the river to the flatter and broader bank. To prevent the timber from being washed away by the river, Heidi allocated the supervision job to Sir Byron. Two nervous-looking serfs stood on the raft and controlled the path of the wooden raft using long sticks. The flow of the White River at this part was already very slow. The river was still, and there was no wind blowing. Still, on a shoddily made raft, they had to be careful with every single movement. As they drifted closer to the shore, they saw a massive palm made of air gently nudging the side of the raft. One of the serfs exclaimed, but the other could see that Dame Heidi was the one manipulating the air to bring the timber to land. With the help of Sir Byron, they stably maneuvered the raft to the shore. Others raced to the shore, untied the ropes and dragged the timber to build the wooden huts. Usually, timber ought to be dried, rid of pests, and processed in order to become quality, durable housing material. But the people didn't care about the details right now. The wood huts built now were only temporary after all. Gawain watched Dame Heidi summon another palm of air to nudge another batch of timber. Magic is convenient indeed. Perhaps there is a way to properly utilize it. Gawain approached Heidi along the riverbank. That palm made of air looks rather impressive. Heidi wiped the sweat off her brow. The sculpture hand is a very basic magic. I practiced it enough so that it could last for a longer time. In this way, even a very heavy raft could be pushed to the shore. If the flow of water was even just a little faster, however, it would probably be much harder. Gawain recalled the memories of 700 years ago. Building the Anzu kingdom required him to become more than a knight. He picked up some theories about magic, and he knew enough to know that what Heidi did was far more complicated than she made it seem. Gawain was impressed. "Don't sell yourself short, Dame Heidi." Behind her stoicism, Heidi blushed. "I started learning magic at a young age, but my ability to focus was weak. Spell molds were too complicated to build, and even now I'm only a grade 3 mage. To ascend a level would be too hard, so here I am just strengthening the spells I possess." Gawain looked to the forest and thought of his other descendant. Rebecca's flair for magic is worse. Her repertoire consists of 4 kinds of fireballs. The thought of Rebecca made Heidi sigh. She has a great volume of magical power, and far better focus than I did when I was her age, but she can't build spell molds at all. Heidi lowered her head. "She's a hard-working child. I've seen her practice her spells tirelessly in secret. It's a shame she just lacks the innate talent." Heidi looked at Gawain. "Do you remember the rogue mage from the woods?" Gawain nodded. Heidi sighed again. "Most mages end up like him and I, stuck at a low level. It means nothing to have a good theoretical understanding of magic if you can't put it into practice." Gawain thought about it and shook his head. "I don't agree." Yet again, Heidi found herself surprised by Gawain. "How so?" Gawain thought of Rebecca's fireballs. "Theories are not nothing. By the same token, using a lot of spells does not mean a mage is powerful." Heidi frowned. "But if a mage cannot manifest thought to action, spell mold to spell, then what is the point of theory?" Gawain smiled and pointed off to a small hill along the plains. "I think that should be a suitable location. I've sent people to Tanzan town to purchase some more material. When they arrive, they will start constructing your magic laboratory, right on that hill." Heidi froze. "Magic laboratory, but the cost?" Gawain waved his hand. "I took a few mithril coins from inside the mountains. These are more common coins that do not need to be smelted down. They should be able to pay for a basic set of materials for the laboratory." Heidi broke out into a smile, recalling the task Gawain had given her previously. "I understand. I'll print out the blueprints that you have requested when the crystal resonator arrives." With her old laboratory in the Cecil territory destroyed, Dame Heidi was overjoyed to see her ancestor devoting resources so early on to building out a new one. Gawain patted Heidi's shoulder. Those who use magic without theory are mindless beasts, no different from monkeys with sticks. Those who use magic with theory blaze a trail for the future of humanity. You need not be the best spellcaster in all of Lauren, Heidi. All you need is a curious mind and the resources to help you develop your magic further. Heidi beamed and looked at the hill, imagining the magic laboratory built. In the meantime, Gawain wondered if Rebecca ought to have a laboratory all to herself, so she can practice her fireballs to her heart's content. More batches of timber flowed from the woods as the day went along. The serfs and commoners worked to pitch tents and build huts at a steady pace. Everyone moved in a perfect symphony. The territory was coming together, slowly but surely. At the center of it all, Gawain headed back into his tent, reminded of the items the old Gawain Cecil had stored in the mithril vault. Now that everything seems to be in order, I ought to take a closer look at those strange crystal fragments. The camp had to be built slowly. Even though Gawain drew up many regulations and plans, and even a draft for the next step in expanding and completing the camp into a permanent encampment, not all of his ideas could be realized overnight. In Anzú, there was no literacy among the commoners and serfs. They could understand diagrams, but they needed knights to help them make sense of measurements and numbers on the page. Therefore, progress moved slowly. And as he attempted to delegate, Gawain recalled Heidi's consideration that there wasn't enough manpower. She had understood the situation considerably, it turned out. In his tent, Gawain mulled over the situation at his desk. Several large pieces of paper were scattered across the desk, and they were covered with all kinds of scribbles, construction plans, supply management, campsite sketches, and a rough plan for future constructions which included walls, wharfs, settlements, production buildings, crop fields, and so on. There were ink, pens, pencils, and a ruler placed on one side of the desk. On the other side lay Amber. Gawain groaned and grabbed Amber by her collar, dragging her off the table. She snorted and wriggled, still asleep. Gawain lugged her across the tent. Suddenly Amber's eyes popped open. The half-elf yelped and disappeared into a shadow. "You scared me!" In a puff of shadows, Amber reappeared on the other side of the tent, her arms folded and her eyes glaring at Gawain. "I thought it was an earthquake." Gawain sighed. "And I thought you were a guard. Is this how you guard my plans? By sleeping?" Amber stuck her tongue out at him. "I was lying on your ugly drawings, I'll have you know. No thief would have gotten it out from under me." Gawain looked down at the blueprints. "Of course, you've drooled on it too." Amber looked away, chastened. "I can't control that when I sleep." Gawain ignored her and instead sat at his desk. Amber hopped over to the other side of the table. She planted her elbows on the desk and popped her chin in her hands. "What are you doing? Working on more ugly drawings?" Gawain didn't look up as he scrawled on paper. "These are not ugly drawings. They are plans, regulations, construction schematics. They're the foundation of the camp, which is why you needed to look after them, not drool on them." Amber held up one of the pieces of paper and stared at it. "This is nonsense. I can't make heads or tails of it." Gawain raised his eyebrows, skeptically. "You're holding it upside down." "Oh!" She looked some more. "I've seen magic spells less complicated than this. This is why you need to learn. Knowledge is very important." Gawain sighed, not surprised that Amber could not understand these things. She was a mere thief who had never received formal education and was taught to do unscrupulous things under the guidance of her father come teacher, together with a bunch of inexplicable shadow-affiliated talents. She could only live life on the edge of this world. To her, schooling was neither a choice nor a necessity. Therefore, her literacy level was just enough for basic reading and writing. The things that Gawain drew on the paper contained a bunch of weird nouns, various figures and annotations. Even someone as educated as Heidi would struggle to make sense of it. Gawain looked the thief in the eye. "If you're too bored guarding diagrams, you can always go learn a thing or two of Dame Heidi or Viscountess Rebecca, like I told you to earlier." Amber groaned and plopped her head on the desk. She groaned. Gawain smirked. He didn't know her real age, but she was acting like an impetuous teen. That's so boring. I don't like interacting with nobles. Besides, that beautiful great-great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter of yours is so busy she wouldn't have time to entertain me. Rebecca might be less busy, but she'll just want to throw fireballs at me. Gawain looked at her with a faint smile. You don't like interacting with nobles? You seem to be very open when hanging out with me. Amber shrugged. You're different, not like a noble. Gawain nodded. You're very different from elves I've known too. Gawain shuffled the papers on his desk into tidy stacks. Then he reached into a bag hanging off his chair and removed a few crystals which he set on the desk. Amber watched curiously. I'm a half-elf and adopted by humans. How am I supposed to know what a true elf should be like? Are you not writing anything today? You're going to study these rocks. Gawain sighed. All her questioning was starting to make his head hurt. If you wouldn't mind being a little silent, I would be eternally grateful. Amber waved her hand at him. This is no fun at all. Go study your rocks. Amber spun around and vanished into thin air. Gawain waited a moment. There was still a faint disturbance in the atmosphere. He smiled. She's still there, but as long as she's not chattering, I'll let her be. Gawain focused on the crystals in front of him. These were the ones he had kept in his magical safe in St. Soniel. When they had been gathering their people and resources in Tanzan town, he had Heidi investigate them for him. She told him that they didn't resonate with any magic she could conjure. They might as well be ordinary rocks. But then, why did Gawain Cecil treasure them in his mithril vault? Gawain could only guess that the crystals were definitely extraordinary, just not on a magical level, or that modern magic theories were unable to explain them. He put aside those that were obviously fragments of the crystal and picked up the complete piece. A part of the core structure was visible in the crystal fragments, but it was difficult to accurately observe it with the naked eye. He would have to wait until after they construct Heidi's magical laboratory and use her crystal resonating machine. He held the crystal against the light and observed it. There was a light glowing along the edges of the beautiful, sparkling crystal. With changing angles of incidence, every side and line displayed different colors and ray patterns. This crystal was extremely precise in any form and must have been processed very skillfully. On top of that, after testing with the crystal fragments, Gawain had confirmed that they had an alarming strength, extraordinarily hard, and unlike typical fragile crystals that would break easily. They could even make scratches on mithril easily without wearing out the tips at all. It made him very curious as to how the 4 crystals had been crushed into such a state. After observing the crystal against the sun, Gawain set the crystal on his desk. He then drew his dagger and pricked his finger. He carefully let a drop of blood fall on the crystal. Nothing happened. He could hear a faint laughter from a certain half-elf, still hidden in the shadows. Ignoring Amber, Gawain held onto the crystal and slipped into deep thoughts, thinking about how there were more and more inexplicable things happening in the world. Crystals from unknown origins, memories that disappeared suddenly, a sun that felt like a gaseous giant planet but did not have properties of a normal gaseous giant planet, as well as those surveillance satellites that floated in the sky. Where he'd come from. Just as his thoughts moved to surveillance satellites, he felt slight heat in his hands. At first he thought it was his illusion, but the crystal started to tremble a little as the pale blue glow in its core became a little brighter. Gawain looked at the crystal, horrified, but before he could grab his pen to note down the changes in the crystal, he suddenly heard a sound in his head. Rather than a sound, it was more like a message that directly entered the inner world, and he understood its contents. Mental frequency reset, re-establishing connection. Then everything went black. Gawain felt as if he had lost consciousness, but he could still think. It was like an influx of data had overwhelmed every sense. Some pictures started to form in his head. It was a view of the ground from high up in the sky. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, fear gripping every sense. Am I going back up to the heavens again? His forehead broke out in cold sweat. Ironically, this helped calm him down. He touched his forehead. He felt the beads of sweat on his skin. He could feel himself still sitting in his chair. What he was seeing before him was just an image projected into his mind. Gawain took a deep breath. The panic he felt before melted away into excitement, and he tried to make sense of what he saw. Only then he realized that there was a huge abnormality in that picture, which was nothing like what he was used to. The picture became blurry, and it was as though there was a layer of filter that produced weird color distributions, smeared in red, like a picture from a thermal imager. Only structures like mountain ranges, forests, and rivers could be recognized. On top of that, this weird, blurry picture was constrained within a very small boundary. That was the northern part of the Dark Mountains and the area surrounding the New Cecil territory. From the top, the White River, the western part of the forest, and even a silhouette of the camp were vaguely visible. The picture could not be zoomed in or out. What's watching us? The images were only visible to Gawain, so he focused on them as best as he could. From what he could recognize, he could tell that they were indeed showing the terrain of the Cecil's current settlement. He could see the land within a 100-kilometer radius, and the zooming function that he had once been so familiar with was now unavailable. The images were confined to this area, unable to be moved or scaled. Also, his original satellite view, once as clear as a crystal, was now reduced to this blurry, strangely colored one. What do these colors mean? Is it thermal imaging, or some other kind of induction imaging? Or was it simply a fault? Gawain remembered clearly the voice he had heard as he fell from his lofty orbit. He had heard it say that there was a damaged power source, a failure of mainframe restarting, and the initiating of some escape sequence. So it was highly possible something had gone wrong in the sequence. In addition, he was now unable to scale the images he saw, which only raised more questions. With only the blurry images to go off of, Gawain began to tease out this train of thought. His soul, his mental consciousness had mutated. Even though he was able to touch down on land and acquire a human body, he still retained some sort of connection with the thing in the sky. For the past few months, he had been offline from it, but the crystal had re-established the link. As for that ancient device, he still had no notion what it was. It could be a space station or a satellite, but either way it was in poor condition. It was unclear if the power source came back on or if the mainframe was eventually rebooted, but in any case it had survived and was still in operation. Although the images under its surveillance were now pretty sloppy, this at least proved that it still existed. A horrifying thought crept over Gawain. What if the thing in the sky broke for good? Would that mean death for him down on Loren? He grimaced. He suspected that the escape sequence that he heard about had something to do with his rebirth in Gawain Cecil's body, but whether that protected him from this object's damage was another question entirely. As his troubled thoughts boiled, Gawain noticed that the image was not stationary, but in fact the patches of color were always slightly shifting and changing. Some of the areas brightened while others slowly dimmed. Though the image itself remained static, these fluctuations continued in a repetitive manner, and just as Gawain was trying to come to a conclusion on the pattern of the image changes, things changed again. He suddenly saw a box appear above the image, like a floating window. In it flashed a line of flickering, trembling words. Gawain did not recognize the language. It was not Mandarin, but nor was it a language of any kingdom in Loren. Yet even as he stared at the words, confused, their meaning appeared in his mind. New data. Giant planet activity increasing, raising the alert level to 4. The image started to flicker and waver in front of his face. Gawain gasped and sat up in his chair. Gawain looked around. He was in his tent. He blinked, focusing on what he had just seen. Gawain gasped. In front of him he saw the thermal, blurry bird's-eye view. He then focused and blinked again. He looked around, back on Loren. His head throbbed with pain. Switching between visions was no easy task. He stood, shakily, and rushed toward the tent flap. In his rush he forgot that Amber was standing invisible in the tent. He felt her body bounce off of him. "Hey!" But he had no time to apologize. He rushed outside. He rushed past a pair of guards who exchanged confused looks. Gawain ignored them. Instead, he stared up at that giant planet, what the people of Loren called their sun. What does giant planet activity increasing mean? From his view, the great sun was moving slowly and majestically in the sky, its circling halo of light floating around it like a gentle mist. It did not look out of the ordinary. Gawain furrowed his brow. Could the satellite have been mistaken? But no sooner had he thought those words than the surface of the sun began to show streaks of red, as if the sun was a giant bloodshot eye. Gawain shifted his view to the satellite position. On the ground he could glimpse little motions of colour moving around the ground. The colours were deepening in intensity, some deep blues and oranges, reds and turquoises lit up. Eventually they stabilised. Some numbers popped up alongside the blurry images, but they did nothing to elucidate the image before him. These colours must be part of the mapping process, whatever that is. Gawain moved his attention back to the camp. Some of the civilians and serfs had paused their work and looked up at the sky as well. They spoke to each other, warily. Gawain followed their gazes. The red lines on the sun had increased in number. There were even red patches there. Heidi, who was helping to fortify the foundation with mud and stone nearby, noticed the change as well. She glanced up at the sun for a moment, then rushed over to Gawain's side. "It seems the red lines are back." Gawain waved a hand, motioning for her to stay quiet. His eyes were on the sun, but his attention was focused on the image in his consciousness. After a while, the reddish part of the sun finally stopped spreading. The text of the image monitor changed, and a new prompt popped up. This one he understood immediately. "New data, the giant planet has regained stability." Alert lifted. No sooner had the text appeared but the red lines faded away. The floating colours on the image in Gawain's mind calmed and returned to the way it was. However, although the image monitor had removed its warning, Gawain was still on high alert. The new discoveries became new clues. When a lot of new clues came out at once and piled up, they became new problems. He began to produce countless conjectures and reasonings, with some of them being so bold they were insane. However, he forced these down, firstly calming himself down, before searching for an explanation that would bring him closer to the truth. He felt Heidi's hand on his shoulder and nearly jumped. "Ancestor, are you all right?" Dame Heidi examined his face with concern. "You look unwell." Amber had emerged from the tent to see what Gawain was up to. She chirped up. "He rushed out of the tent right before the red spots started to appear on the sun and scared the heck out of me." Gawain cut her off. He turned to Heidi, his face serious. "Heidi, can you sense any magical changes?" Heidi thought for a moment. "A little earlier I felt a surge of magic in the air. Briefly, magic became easier to cast, but that's not unusual when red spots appear on the sun. Normally that only happens once every few years, but they have been getting more frequent." Heidi paled. "Could this have something to do with the monsters, the dark wave?" Gawain shook his head. He let out a large breath. "No, this won't make monsters appear, not yet anyway." Gawain's heart was thumping, and he felt quite nervous about this new event, but he couldn't let any fear show. That would only make the situation worse. He also had to worry about his connection with some sort of satellite in the sky. But weakness and hesitation would not solve any problems. Gawain raised his hands placatingly. "Don't worry, there won't be any monsters. Even if the monsters arrive, I have experience with them." Gawain looked reassuringly at his descendant. "Let's focus on making this camp perfect. That way we can deal with whatever the world throws at us." Heidi let out a sigh of relief, calmed by Gawain's outward resolve. She bowed slightly and returned to reinforcing the wall with magic. Gawain watched her return. Although Dame Heidi and Rebecca were aristocrats, their open-mindedness had a foundation that could be built upon, especially in regard to the improvements in the social order. Otherwise, a lady like Dame Heidi, who was an aristocrat in every way, would never go to the construction site and use her magic to assist with the efforts. As Gawain looked on at the rapidly strengthening foundation under the use of magic and was awed by its convenience, he also realized something. Once the hardware to mint coins was in place, it would be a good idea to hire some down-and-out rogue mages to help build the camp. Before that, though, there were other more important problems to think through. Gawain turned back and returned to the tent. Sitting at his table, he scribbled down 3 questions on a blank piece of paper. How are the sun and the dark wave related? What is the surveillance satellite? What is it for? How badly damaged is it? He paused for one moment before writing the final, most worrisome query. And why did Gawain Cecil leave behind a crystal that could connect with it? The satellite perspective remained in Gawain's mind's eye, even as he put the crystal away. He found that with focus, he could switch his focus between the aerial image and his own sight. It had nothing to do with the crystal, at least so it seemed, unless the crystal was something of a catalyst, forming a link between his consciousness and the satellite up above. After sitting down at his study table, Gawain reviewed the details and problems he had jotted down on paper. He closed his eyes and concentrated, trying to piece together as much as he could. According to the memories of Gawain Cecil and the notes from the rogue mage, he was certain that the changes with the sun in the sky were directly related to the dark wave. Every time red spots appeared on the sun, the magic of the land and the activity of elemental power surged. The so-called dark wave was a sudden, chaotic outbreak of magic, elemental powers avalanching out of control, the material world eroding with corrupted magical energy. As for the monsters that appeared in the elemental storms, they were of unknown origins, and perhaps ought to be classified as a secondary phenomenon after the initial burst of chaotic energy. The inhabitants of this world were not blind to the correlation between the sun's red spots and changes in magical energy. They revered the Sun-Owl as a source of elemental power after all. Gawain frowned. Perhaps then, sunspots lead to fluctuations in energy here in this world. But over time, as the energy builds and builds and reaches a critical point, the natural harmony of elemental powers is completely disrupted, and the dark wave is born. Gawain opened his eyes. Is the sun not what is responsible for so much destruction then? Is it really those red spots that cause surges in magical power? Or are they perhaps affected by something else entirely? Gawain jotted down a key question on the piece of paper. What is the nature of the sun? It was a massive star, a gas giant that made the Earth's sun look like a mere moon. According to what Gawain Gao had learned back on his home planet, gas giants were not supposed to emit light or heat, even though they were usually abundant with nuclear fuel and emitted a certain amount of radiation. They were akin to a cool, unlit furnace that had not yet reached the point of nuclear fusion. In contrast, the sun in this world was obviously a source of light and heat for the land. Has this sun been ignited? Or is this a unique characteristic because of the different laws of physics? Gawain mulled over this. Personally, he preferred the second explanation. The red spots and magical surges were a constant reminder that this world and his home world operated on vastly different rules. The mere existence of magic threw logical thinking out the window. If he limited himself to thinking from the perspective of an earthling, he might be wasting his time trying to answer these questions. He sat back and sighed. If I am to use Earth's knowledge, however, it might be possible to conclude that this star was not once a star giant. If it had already been ignited and is currently undergoing nuclear fusion, the heat it should be emitting would turn this entire world into ashes. Gawain wrote down his hypothesis on the paper. The sun was a gas giant of a special nature, whose activity might have a correlation with the magic on the land. Perhaps it is a kind of radiation. These claims still had to be proven. But with no way of proving them currently, Gawain moved on to the second big question. What is this surveillance satellite? Perhaps it was something left over from an ancient civilization. Perhaps it was some kind of observation post left by spacefaring aliens. The civilization that had built it must have been extremely advanced, or at least one that was not afraid of the dark wave. Gawain remembered the severe damage the satellite had sustained in the moments leading up to his transmigration. No one had come to repair it. This eye in the sky had been left out in space, abandoned or forgotten. At least that means we don't have to worry about an alien invasion anytime soon. Gawain stepped out of his tent where the workers of his new territory hammered away at tents and huts, all working under his leadership. Gawain looked up at the sky. Perhaps the satellite was there to monitor the levels of magical power in this world. He closed his eyes and shifted his focus to the clear aerial view of the planet, a perspective he could now shift freely to. The high-definition view consisted of various layers of color overlapping over each other. Perhaps these shades and colors are indicative of flows of elemental and magic power. If this satellite is monitoring magic, then perhaps it was placed here as a means of detecting the coming of the next dark wave. If the logic was right, this would be at least one of the satellite's functions. Gawain concentrated on the aerial view some more. He winced. The image flickered, growing blurry. The satellite's condition is only going to get worse. Gawain returned to his tent and sat down. He stared at the final question he had jotted down. Why did Gawain Cecil leave this crystal behind 700 years ago? Gawain observed the crystal some more. There were things about it he still did not understand, but calling it a catalyst for a link between his mind and the satellite seemed like a reasonable conclusion. Could this crystal be of use to anyone else? Is there someone I trust, that I can even confide this to? How did Gawain Cecil of the past use it? How did he find it, or use it, or even know of the satellite? Then, a new thought formed. The Gawain Cecil of old had the heavy burden of leading people to safety, building up a new kingdom from scratch, and fending off monsters of the Dark Wave. To have succeeded, he would have needed a lot of help. Something to keep him abreast of the whole continent, an eye in the sky. Gawain sighed to himself. Hypotheses were not enough. He needed a means to experiment and verify. Gawain held the crystal, feeling its smooth surface. I need someone to help me test these suspicions. But if anyone else saw the aerial view, would they freak out? Or would they see it as just a magical ability? His eyes drifted over to Amber, idly daydreaming, probably thinking about the purple steel door and how to steal pieces of it. She felt Gawain's gaze on her and turned around. A chill ran down her spine as she jumped up. What are you looking at? I didn't do it. Unless you think I did something good, in which case it was all me. Gawain let out an exasperated sigh. Amber is out of the question. Who knows what will happen if I let her touch the crystal? As Gawain dismissed the idea, a soldier stepped in. Rebecca has finished surveying the nearby lands. Gawain nodded. Tell her to come at once and report to me. The soldier rushed out, and moments later, Rebecca hurried into Gawain's tent. She had spent half the day running around outside, but showed no signs of fatigue. Lord Ancestor, you won't believe how good the land is nearby. I thought the land on this side of the Dark Mountains was all barren, but according to the map you gave me, I actually found. Gawain waved a hand to interrupt her. It's okay, we can get to that later. He placed the crystal in her hand. I have another task for you. Rebecca nodded brightly. Of course, what is it? Gawain smiled. Rebecca is the complete opposite of Amber. She's kind, a little bit naive, but most of all trustworthy. Gawain placed both hands on Rebecca's shoulders. Imagine a really, really high place, higher than the clouds. Imagine someone overlooking the land. Rebecca blinked, then her eyes lit up. Oh, are you talking about the Eye of Mystery? Gawain frowned. The Eye of Mystery? Rebecca nodded frantically. It's a kind of ability mages have. Those that are powerful enough can transcend their eyes beyond the body and observe the entire world through a subconscious connection. Gawain shook his head. No, it's not that. It's even higher than the Eye of Mystery. And it's a physical entity, like a magical tool. Rebecca closed her eyes and focused. She drew in a deep breath. Gawain leaned in, anticipating, but Rebecca opened her eyes. I don't see anything. It's dark when I close my eyes. Gawain could only mutter under his breath. Of course it is. Gawain gave Rebecca some more instructions, but it seemed that no connection could be made between her mind and the satellite up above. He decided to be a bit more daring and asked Amber to try it. She did not sense anything either. For Gawain, this felt like enough to conclude that no one else except himself could establish a link with the mysterious eye in the sky. So the question remained. Why did Gawain Cecil leave behind this crystal 700 years ago? There were two possibilities. One, Gawain Cecil, 700 years ago, was special and somehow found a way to use these crystals. Two, these crystals were left by him to be used 700 years later. As Gawain thought of the shards of the crystal he found in Four Crown Street's mithril safe, he realized both possibilities could be true. Lord Ancestor. Gawain turned to Rebecca, who looked disappointed that she had failed his impossible test. Perhaps it's because I have no magical talent. Gawain shook his head quickly. No, it's not because of you. I just wanted you to hold the crystal for a second. He changed the topic before he could accidentally reveal anything more. Tell me about the results of the survey. Rebecca lightened up again. Right, of course. I went to the area where you pointed it out and found that the land was actually unpolluted. The terrain was open and level too, and there was easy access to water. The farmers, who also came along, said that it was the most arable stretch of land they've ever seen. Gawain was not surprised. He knew that about a decade ago the pollution in this area would have already subsided. The rest of the kingdom was just too scared to get close. Rumours spread about the polluted land and the yearly toxic winds so often that these rumours became truths. Thanks to these so-called truths, no one ever touched the treasure inside the Dark Mountains. Gawain corrected himself. As fertile as the land was, there were still toxic storms to be wary of. But as far as he could confirm with the help of the eye in the sky, there was no dark wave pollution left in the soil itself. Of all the kingdoms, Viscount Andrew was the most likely to know that the land had healed. The nobles of the southern border had a responsibility to monitor the polluted wastelands of Gondolia, but Gawain guessed Viscount Andrew likely slacked off. In his cosy mining town, he probably would not care to invest in polluted land even if he knew about it. Gawain drew out a few borders along the map of the territory and showed them to Rebecca. At present, these are the only confirmed uncontaminated areas. The pollution in areas farther out should also have waned off, but will stay put for the moment. The metadata in his aerial view told him the image in his mind was taken a decade ago, which meant that the polluted areas would have shrunk even more. Seeing no way to get a more recent image of the world from above, he figured it was still best to take precautions. Gawain leaned back. For now, all he could do was wait. Over the next couple of days, the new work system truly came to fruition. Even the most skeptical of serfs gradually admitted that this new lord kept true to his promises of rewards. The smart Alex, who tried to cheat and slack, learned something more painful than eating vegetable stew while watching others eat meat. That was watching others eat vegetable stew with nothing to eat themselves. With the help of Heidi, the system had been fully implemented amongst all the people of the Cecil territory. With the new system taking effect, the construction of the outpost camp was being completed at an astonishing speed. Preparation soon began for the arrival of the main party. According to Gawain's plan, the fence around the camp expanded hundreds of meters out to the south and east, respectively. An open field was reserved for the incoming 700 people for their tents to be set up, the sheds for carpenters, stonemasons, blacksmiths, and also for storing materials. He also ordered the construction of a temporary pier at the campsite facing the riverbank, and a sawmill nearby to process the wood arriving down the stream from the logging site. Of course, manpower was so spread out that the pier and sawmill did not exist yet. Even with Heidi assisting with her magic, finishing all the buildings in the camp would be a stretch. Gawain sighed. If only Rebecca knew any other spell than fireballs. Standing on high ground by the riverbank, Gawain gazed out to a large house being completed in the distance. Among the tents and huts, this was one of the few buildings that could actually be considered a house. Combined with the area around it, it would be used temporarily as a forge. A soldier ran up to Gawain and gave a salute. "Sir, the surveying of the iron ore mine has been completed. We can begin retrieving some ores for inspection." Gawain nodded. "At haste, soldier." The soldier scurried off, shouting some orders. With the first batch of ores ready to be excavated out of the mine, the Cecil territory would soon enter its Iron Age. Still, Gawain worried. The impending dark wave and the satellite in the sky gave him a headache. "We're progressing too slowly. In this current state, how will we be ready when the dark wave comes?" Amber joined Gawain by the riverbank and frowned. "Why are you sighing? Do you think I did something? I promise I didn't steal anything." Gawain looked at her with a sigh. "Not everything is about you, Amber. It's too slow. All of this." Amber's eyes widened. "Look at how fast everyone is working. You call this slow?" She waved her arms exaggeratedly. These are the fastest working serfs I have ever seen in my entire life. They took less than a day's time to complete the additional fencing for the wall, and today they're already nearly done building the forge, Amber murmured more quietly. When you gave them meat and forbade whipping as a punishment, I thought you were a good person. Gawain shot a look. I am a good person. Everyone is working hard, but it's still not enough to keep up with my plans. Amber pouted. Then your plan is unrealistic. You've been acting weird lately, you know? All you do is pace around and mutter under your breath and jot down weird-looking notes. The whole camp is coming together nicely. So why do you look like you've got ants in your pants? Gawain rolled his eyes. Maybe because the world might be ending. Amber pointed up at the giant sun owl. Because of the red spots on the sun? You've been panicky since then. Gawain scoffed, concealing his surprise. Are you watching me when you have nothing to do? Amber stood with her arms akimbo. I'm a keen observer. But everyone else has noticed it too. Even Rebecca. She's just too scared you'll scold her. Now Gawain was genuinely surprised. Really? Has it been that obvious? He reflected on his own shift in attitude when a petite figure ran towards the riverbank. It was Betty, in a rough plain dress. She stopped before Gawain, caught her breath and pointed towards one of the tents. Dame Heidi is asking for you. Gawain raised a brow. What does she want? Betty panted loudly, still catching her breath, unable to give a response. Amber cocked her head, looking Betty up and down. Where is your precious pan? Lady Rebecca said this is our new home, so I found a kitchen and put the pan there. Gawain looked out towards the horizon and found the answer to his own question. The reason why Heidi was calling for him. He saw it in the distance. The second party of the Cecil clan arrived in their new territory, all 700 odd of them.